We've come to the last session of our course on global civics. Let's review what we have learned and consider what other questions remain. We started our survey with the diagnosis of our growing interdependence. Interdependence was a central theme of the two reports on 2030 that we read for the first week. Manifestations of our interdependence is everywhere. Carbon dioxide emissions from China affect temperature and precipitation, which in turn affects agriculture in Bangladesh or whether the Maldives will stay over water. Financial engineering in the United States, or the manner in which public debt is calculated or miscalculated in Greece, have dramatic repercussions for employment and growth all around the world. A pandemic emerging from Vietnam or Mexico, or a nuclear leak from Japan have consequences for public health halfway around the world. We concluded that this was a significant development that it was likely to accelerate. In the last 200 years, we have gained greater control of our destinies. This was possible through technology and democracy. We all essentially assume that we author the storyboard of our lives. And yet, if our interdependence is going to continue and even accelerate, this means that our lives will be co-authored by others whom we don't know and may not even like. We observed that there was a generational dimension to our increasing global interdependence. For the first time in human history, we live in a world where a 20-year-old has significant shared interests with other 20-year-olds halfway around the world. If we don't address climate change, for example, all those 20-year-olds will suffer greatly no matter where they live. Yet our world has traditionally been organized on the assumption that 20-year-olds share interests with 70-year-olds in their own nation state, but not with other 20-year-olds halfway around the world. Therefore, it was important for this global classroom of mainly young people to consider what were the forces pushing us together, precisely what is in our shared interest, and what kind of rapport you wish to have with people with whom you share your planet and your destinies, but not your country. We assume that finding solutions to our challenges of this growing interdependence was not just a technocratic puzzle to be cracked, but it required some kind of a global social contract, some understanding of our common bonds, and the level of solidarity we wish to practice. Those questions in turn depend on our diagnosis regarding our interdependence. Are we really in this together? What are the various centripetal forces and the different methodologies we have to deal with cross-border consequences? What are the stakes? We argued that global civics is not only necessary, but is also feasible. The dominant narratives about international affairs tend to underestimate the role of ideas and norms. They insist that all power is hard power, and that being respected is no substitute for being feared. The great power game of nations always continues, we are told, even when a higher goal or rhetoric is evoked. Superpowers are selfish, arbitrary, and dangerous nations, and they should not be embarrassed to be so. Countries should not feel constrained by international legitimacy and laws, warns the cynics. We, on the other hand, argued that while power relations and interests exist and are important, they are not the only variable that we should be concerned about. One analogy that has been used to explain global civics is the way we drive. Each day, many of us drive at speeds above 50 miles an hour in a ton of metal, extremely close to others who are doing the same thing. A slight move in the steering wheel in the wrong direction would wreak havoc, but we cruise carefree. Because we drive in an implicit fellowship with other drivers and have reasonable expectations about their behavior. Such fellowship with and expectations of other drivers serve to mitigate the theoretical risks of driving, and they exist because people follow long-established frameworks of laws, of habits, of conventions about how to operate automobiles. If we could not count on other drivers and the pattern of the roads, we would drive far more cautiously, and even the most fortified vehicle would not be sufficient to manage the risks. Global civics is the corresponding mental map and compass we need in navigating, not in traffic, but in an increasingly interdependent world. In our pursuit, we refer to social science scholars including Adam Smith, Max Weber, Jon Alster, Robert Putnam, and others who recognize the role of norms, social capital, trust, predictability, and all kinds of other less than immediately tangible factors. They demonstrated convincingly that a shared set of norms provide the predictability and decrease the cost of doing business, or even being a community. If anything is possible, even a simple transaction would require all kinds of eventualities and contingencies to be planned and prepared for. Since even the most comprehensive legal document cannot cover all eventualities, some transactions simply do not take place in low predictability, low trust settings, depressing welfare prospects. If, on the other hand, one can operate in a high trust, high predictability environment, transaction costs are lowered and welfare potential is maximized. Kemal Dervish, in his introduction to global civics, observed this phenomenon and argued that if all behavior were to be governed strictly and only by individual self-interest and a cold-blooded calculation of benefits and costs, national communities would be very costly, if not impossible, to govern. A sense of civics, he argued, is part of the cement that holds a community together, and that reduces the cost of governing and enables the compromises that deliver the public goods. Cristina Bicchieri describes norms as the grammar of a society. Like grammar in language, they are often implicit as they are formative. Norms are dynamic and are sustained and reproduced by people who act as conditional cooperators. Majority of people uphold norms and cooperate when they expect others to cooperate, and they forsake cooperation when they observe majorities defecting. Elsewhere, Robert Axelrod had explored how cooperation emerges in a world of egoists and without central authority. And he discovered that starting out with cooperation and then reciprocating both cooperation and defection has proved to be an exceptionally resilient and successful strategy in several simulated experiments. Others, such as Edward Wilson and Brian Skirms, have set out to discover how the golden rule of doing unto others what you wish them do unto you and the Kantian categorical imperative, which you will recall from week 8, were evolutionary advantages. Bowles and Gintes argued that our linguistic skills are key to our ability to formulate general norms, to erect social institutions, to communicate rules and what they entail, to alert others to their violation, and to organize coalitions to punish the violators. Bicchieri too underscores the multiple ways in which communication elicits and elucidates norms. We learn and reproduce norms by talking and debating them. We considered the Ultimatum Game. This was an experiment, as you may recall, where two people are given $100 and the first person decides how to split the money. The second person has no say in what the split should be, hence the ultimatum. The second person can either accept the split and they each get their proposed share, or she or he can reject the split, in which case they both receive nothing. If one has a dim view of humanity, one may be surprised to learn that the average split is 60-40. Furthermore, we see that offers worse than 80-20 are routinely rejected by those in the second position, which is interesting and begs an explanation. Why didn't those people in the second position accept even $1, as that is better than nothing? It turns out that ours is a species which is willing to pay a price to uphold fairness and the generic ethics of reciprocity. I should add that overgenerosity is also frequently rejected. That is, when the first person keeps only $40 and offers $60 to the second person. In many cases, the second person rejects that offer, as she or he does not want to be indebted even implicitly. These features of our common humanity may not find adequate place in our narratives or popular culture, but are nevertheless indispensable to running our societies and may hold the keys to building a global civics. Our interdependence, as we have seen throughout the course, has to do with the increasing ease with which ideas, news, goods, capital, and people move across borders. The first of these dynamics we considered was the movement of ideas and news. Ethan Zuckerman of Massachusetts Institute of Technology referred to Benedict Anderson in explaining how becoming a part of an information and news system created bonds of community. And he then proceeded to show with several maps how the movement of bytes was not as unobstructed as we are inclined to believe. In other words, yes, news and ideas move more easily, but that does not automatically make us citizens of the world. He argued, I think convincingly, that being globally informed was hard work and required a conscious discipline. We then considered international trade, that is, movement of goods. Mohamed Rezin Saleh of the National University of Singapore gave us a historical perspective. International trade was the original force for globalization, and it has grown faster than the world economy and has therefore become a greater part of our lives with each passing year. Through Saleh and Roderick, we considered the arguments for and against free trade. We reviewed the international regime around trade and our dispute settlement mechanisms. With Amar Bhattacharya, we considered the global economy, the interrelated nature of finance, and the meaning of the 2008 crisis. Both Bhattacharya and Roderick put forward the argument that yes, the global economy is interconnected, but that most pain and most gain are national, and cross-border consequences of national economic decisions are best managed through light global governance, better coordination, and increased transparency, and not through something more intrusive and binding. Bhattacharya also gave us a dramatic account of convergence between the affluent West and the rest of the world. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this issue. You may recall the two 2030 reports you read making a similar point. The share of the West in terms of global population has gone from 1/3 a century ago to less than 1/6 now. Economically, 2/3 of the global output came from the West at the end of World War II, and that number is now around 45% and decreasing. One thing these changes mean is that no single country is powerful enough to solve all problems or dictate one set of solutions. The most powerful or resourceful countries are no longer that resourceful, and the nature of our problems have evolved into requiring larger and larger coalitions. This dramatically changes the tonality of our global debates and our global forums. There is one other key result of this convergence, and that is the emergence of a global middle class. We now have many studies describing the global middle class as the fastest growing segment of the world population. And some expect the world to have more people in the middle class than poor people in as little as 10 years. As you may recall from the Milanovic lecture, much of the new entry into middle class is likely to be from emerging economies. This demographics is likely to be another key factor in the way we conceive and respond to our global affairs and our global interdependence. In addition to economy, we reviewed pandemics as another dynamic interlacing our fates. We recall things like the plague, cholera, the Spanish flu, the avian flu, our success with the elimination of smallpox, and the pending elimination of polio. We have found some solace that there was greater consensus and cooperation around surveillance and prevention these days than we had in the 19th century. We also considered where we were with regards to the 45-year-old grand bargain which made the Non-Proliferation Treaty possible. In 1968, the states with nuclear weapons agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, and the rest of the world agreed not to acquire them. We concluded that NPT had not eliminated but slowed down proliferation, and that weapon states had not disarmed fully but had decreased their nuclear arsenals. As such, NPT was a half success. We also observed that, that senior voices around the world with strong national security credentials, people like Henry Kissinger, argued that no total nuclear disarmament was desirable and feasible, and this was a welcome development. We took note that a new wave of scholarship which argues that the world has become less violent and more peaceful not only in battlefields but across many spheres of life. We concluded that this current generation may be the most fortunate generation with longer, healthier, more peaceful and more capable lives than any other generation in history. In addition to analyzing the centripetal forces pushing us together, we pursued a parallel inquiry on how greater global awareness is related to the normative backdrop of our human existence. In life, there are things that we cannot not know or cannot unlearn. If crippling poverty or genocide robs fellow human beings of their dignity, our dignity is also at risk. Therefore, we needed to ponder, what do we do when we become aware of gross inequality or poverty, or when we learn about grave atrocities or genocides? Do we stand idle as dignity of our fellow human beings erode? What options do we have? In that spirit, we reviewed the recent data and developments on the size and trends involving poverty and inequality. We concluded that the world witnessed positive developments with regards to both inequality and poverty. Our options in the case of genocide and other grave crimes was another area of positive developments. In the 21st century, humanity has managed to establish a new norm around responsibility to protect and a new court, the International Criminal Court. Both of these developments are far from being consolidated into effective guarantees, but the fact that they exist is important, and they carry within them the potential to evolve, provided that the global public opinion stays constructively engaged. As you may recall from your readings, some have described the global public opinion as a new superpower. There is indeed a growing global agora with new voices joining the debate each year. Whether this agora will evolve into a meritocratic forum, a global peer review of sorts, whose deliberations and verdicts inspire respect, will be an important factor for every issue we discussed in this course. We also reviewed our cultural and technocratic toolkit as we considered how our response to our current and future interdependence evolves. Thaddeus Metz from University of Johannesburg found narratives of our interdependence in all the major faiths and philosophies in the world. He also found formidable language about our responsibilities to others in these belief systems. Javier Solana gave us the language and the tools to think about global governance and global public goods. Both agreed that a global civics was necessary and feasible. Now let's consider what such a global civics may be about. Consider do no harm. This has been the dictum of the medical doctors for several centuries. It is a proposition which is difficult to disagree with. Not many people can reasonably refuse to commit to a rule like do no harm. And it can go a long way in addressing a number of the cross-border externalities. Harm also figures prominently in the way that people greet each other around the world. Across the Muslim world, the traditional greeting is Salamun Alaikum, which basically means I come in peace. The way one greets people whom one meets was deemed important enough to be included in Islam's canonical text, the Quran. Quran also has rules about how the greeting should be reciprocated. In a telling fashion, Christianity and Judaism have similar greetings, Pax Vobis and Shalom Aleichem. They also mean I come in peace. The military salute has a similar basis. When we salute, our hand gesture is supposed to reveal that we carry no weapons and therefore come in peace. The hands in the logo of the Global Civics Academy are inspired from that universal sign of an open hand as a signal of good faith and readiness to engage and cooperate. In India, Namaste means I revere you or I respect you, and it is reciprocated with the same word. So two people greet each other by confirming their mutual worth in each other's eyes. In the Zulu language, the way people greet each other, Sawubona, means I see you, and is based on the same logic, where an interaction between two people is preceded by confirming each party as bearers of recognition and dignity. In other words, humanity's collective wisdom includes starting an interaction or engagement by first ruling out harm and by establishing the generic normative framework that will govern that interaction. Now, this was not always so. In a recent book, The World Till Yesterday, Jared Diamond describes a world divided between friends, enemies, and strangers. And after reviewing the data, he concludes that we had to assume that in most cases, enemies were strangers. It seems like we started out in a world where we assumed that almost all strangers were enemies, We then evolved into cultures where we made an attempt to form a framework with people whom we met afresh, where that framework was based on reciprocal worth, reciprocal respect, and a commitment of doing no harm. Such a framework was necessary because we existed in increasingly complex societies where we could not hope to have prior knowledge or affinity with everyone we ran into. But we needed to have some predictability in our encounters so that anxiety and friction did not preclude smooth functioning. And we have recently brought about a world where even people in distant lands whom we will never meet in person will have an impact on us and on our lives. Our quest for the last 14 weeks have been about the normative framework we need for this new world. That is, what should be the content of our greeting towards people whom we will not meet in person, but whose actions have bearings on us. This has not been an easy question to answer, but it is nevertheless a necessary one to try to answer. Let's consider do no harm. Can we really say we will do no harm on 7 billion others? Will it be sufficient if most of them commit to doing no harm to us? I would argue that that would be a very encouraging start. We do not need to do any favors to them, and we cannot reasonably expect them to us any favors. But we can aspire to doing no harm and can expect others to do the same. By committing to such a rule, we in essence amend our decision tree, where one of our constant questions become whether our actions cause any harm on others. The welfare of billions of others become part and parcel of our cognitive universe. As Ethan Zuckerman reminded us on a related issue, this is not easy. It is hard work. We have gone from having trust-based relationships with roughly 100 people in a lifetime to interacting with 100 people in a week, and that was already a huge change. And now we are being asked to be conscious of the welfare of billions in each decision. One can also question whether we can really know the predicament of others. Isn't the sheer diversity in the world an extraordinary obstacle for us to comprehend each other's life, bliss, grief? This is, after all, the moral of the story with Tower of Babel, that humanity is too divided between different cultures and languages to effectively comprehend each other. I have to admit, there are times where I find it difficult to explain the sensibilities of the culture I identified with to others, and feel awestruck at the task of comprehending the intricacies of many other cultures. How can I give a full account of the melancholy in a song which I hold dear to people who only have scant knowledge of this society? Or can I ever be sure that I get the full meaning of a novel from Russia or South Africa or South America? It's not easy. However, I don't think we have any other choice but try and start the conversation and work on it. It should start with the full knowledge that it will not be easy. Pretending that it is an easy task would be a mistake and would be counterproductive. We also need to accept that a feasible global civics has to be minimalist and not aspire to find a universal consensus on what good life is. Fortunately, the definition of harm is one of these more straightforward issues. Cultures around the world will not and should not agree on what good life is, but agreeing on what harm is should be easier. So what would a rule such as do no harm mean for the issues that we have reviewed in the preceding weeks? It would mean that we would need to take a greater interest in what happens in other countries and not simply assume that the increasing ease with which information, news, stories move around the world would automatically, without effort, mean greater awareness. It would mean continuing to follow whether international trade works against any group or nation, but on balance feeling good that world trade has increased prosperity, access, choice, and has enriched our lives in multiple ways. Similarly, about the global economy, we would need to continue to pay attention to cross-border effects of economic decisions. We may conclude that in some future iteration of the do no harm rule, we should consider not only whether our actions cause any harm, but also whether our our inactions may have significant opportunity cost. I think climate change would be one issue where a global civics around the do no harm rule would have dramatic implications. We would need to accept that finding the highest safe level of carbon dioxide emissions and dividing that amount equally among the residents of the world is the only acceptable solution. In terms of inequality and poverty, a do no harm approach is likely to find some solace in the high but decreasing inequality and poverty rates. The difference between the climate change and poverty and inequality issues is that business as usual in the case of climate change means extraordinary harm, while business as usual means steady improvement in the case of inequality and poverty. This doesn't mean we can stop to care about inequality and poverty. We continue to need better indicators, better research, better analysis, and better policies, but the urgency of climate change and the potential size of harm are of a different magnitude. Issues around responsibility to protect may require us to amend our do no harm rule. The new version may say, do no harm, and if possible, get out of the way of people who may prevent harm. In other words, you yourself do not need to do anything beyond doing no harm, but if you are aware of an effort which is likely to prevent harm being done, and if you can get out of the way of that effort with little or no cost to yourself, your family, and your country, do that as well. What might that new iteration mean? Remember the UN Volunteer Army? Throughout this course, we have assumed that nation states are our primary unit of organizing. We have assumed that most nation states command the allegiance and the overall consent of their citizens and are effective in delivering outcomes. People who serve at the armed forces of their country cannot be ordered to serve in areas where there is no obvious national interest and risk life and limb. However, we have a new norm of responsibility to protect. So what do? UN volunteer force seems to be one viable option. Yet powerful countries have vetoed this idea for decades. Can we consider lifting this veto as part and parcel of the get out of the way of efforts which can prevent harm? I believe we can, and I believe we should. The cost of allowing volunteers to form a UN force is so negligible that not allowing such a force to be formed would be indefensible under the new version of the do no harm rule. The same can be said of the ratification of crimes of aggression clause for the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court case law will be a central feature of the emerging sense of global conscience. If the only thing that ICC stands for is the end of dictators' impunity to commit atrocities in their own countries, but if we cannot even theoretically hold leaders of militarily powerful countries accountable for the illegal and illegitimate wars that they wage, then the global conscience, which we badly need, will never come of age. There is really no defensible position against crimes of aggression becoming an effective part of ICC jurisprudence. And I would argue that this is one other instance where we can and we should get out of the way of efforts which can prevent significant harm. In any event, the point is not to find one timeless, perfect global civics and set it in stone. What we need is the process and the broad parameters of a draft to be revised and improved by each generation. If civics is the sum total of things we do for the sake of smooth coexistence in the midst of diversity, and if its precise nature in our nation states has been evolving, its global version will also be an evolving draft. The do no harm principle or some variation of it is likely to be a central part of that global civics for some time. But distant future is too dynamic to forecast from now, and the conversation of young people across the world will be too rich and interactive to choreograph. This is your future, and global civics will be forged by you. For your final assignment, you'll get to write your first draft of your global civics. In 2012, we organized a student competition with the United Nations Academic Impact, where students were challenged to imagine themselves as the speechwriter of the Secretary General of the United Nations. They were told that there is today a growing consensus concerning our global interdependence. Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights enshrines everyone's right to an international order where the inherent dignity and rights of all are fully realized. What is less clear, they were told, is what sort of a global civics is necessary and feasible for us to navigate that growing interdependence. They were then asked to draft an imagined speech by the Secretary General on what responsibilities we can all take on towards people who happen not to be our compatriots, and what rights we can claim. You have the same task. You have 1,500 words to draft that speech. Be sure to demonstrate your thorough understanding of the issues and trade-offs we have discussed throughout this course. Good luck.